The Japanese Imperial Navy had every reason to celebrate. Intelligence reports confirmed it. The American carrier USS Yorktown lay crippled at the bottom of the Coral Sea, destroyed beyond salvation. Their pilots had witnessed the devastating hits, the explosions tearing through her flight deck, the black smoke billowing into the tropical sky. She was gone. One less carrier to worry about as they prepared their masterstroke at Midway. But on June 4, 1942, when Japanese reconnaissance planes spotted the American fleet, a ghost materialized on the horizon, a carrier that shouldn't exist, launching aircraft that shouldn't be flying, crewed by men who should have been swimming for their lives. The Yorktown had returned from the dead in just 72 hours, and with her resurrection came the beginning of Japan's nightmare. May 8, 1942, the Coral Sea. The USS Yorktown cut through the azure waters of the South Pacific, her massive flight deck scarred and smoking. 3 days of brutal combat had transformed the pristine carrier into a wounded giant. At 1100 hours, a single Japanese dive bomber, a Nakajima B-5N Kate, had broken through the defensive screen. The 800-pound armor-piercing bomb penetrated the flight deck near the island superstructure, detonating deep within the ship's bowels. The explosion killed 66 men instantly and ignited fires that threatened the forward magazines. Captain Elliot Buckmaster stood on the bridge, his face illuminated by the orange glow of flames consuming his ship. Damage control teams fought desperately below decks, where temperatures exceeded 150 degrees Fahrenheit. The bomb had penetrated 3 decks before exploding in a rag storage compartment, sending shrapnel through ventilation systems and igniting aviation fuel vapors. Secondary explosions rippled through compartments, and for 20 terrifying minutes, the Yorktown's survival hung by a thread. "Fire's contained, Captain," reported Commander Clarence Aldrich, the damage control officer, his uniform soaked with sweat and seawater. "But we've lost boiler room number 1. Maximum speed reduced to 24 knots. 24 knots. For a fleet carrier designed to operate at 32 knots, this was a crippling injury. The Yorktown could no longer keep pace with her task force, couldn't generate sufficient wind over the deck for fully loaded aircraft launches, and had become vulnerable to any pursuing Japanese surface force. But the damage ran deeper than speed. The bomb had fractured structural frames, twisted steel bulkheads, and compromised the carrier's watertight integrity. Seawater seeped into damaged compartments. The ship listed 2 degrees to port. Engineering crews worked in near darkness, their flashlights cutting through smoke and steam as they shored up weakened bulkheads with timber and welded temporary patches over ruptures in the hull. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commander of Task Force 17, faced an agonizing decision. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been a strategic victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had been turned back, the first time in the war that a Japanese offensive had been stopped. But the cost had been severe. The carrier USS Lexington, Yorktown's sister ship, had been so badly damaged that she had to be scuttled. Now Yorktown herself was wounded, vulnerable, and thousands of miles from the nearest repair facility. "Get her to Pearl Harbor," Fletcher ordered. "Whatever it takes." The journey back became an exercise in survival. The Yorktown's crew worked around the clock, pumping water from flooded compartments, reinforcing damaged structures, and maintaining constant vigilance against submarine attacks. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft shadowed them for 2 days, circling like vultures, photographing the smoking carrier and reporting her condition to Imperial Navy headquarters. In Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence analyzed the reconnaissance photographs with satisfaction. The damage assessment was clear. The Yorktown had suffered catastrophic structural damage. Even if she somehow limped back to Pearl Harbor, repairs would require at least 3 months in dry dock, more likely 6. One American carrier effectively removed from the order of battle. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and now planning the decisive battle at Midway, studied the intelligence reports. The Americans had only 3 operational carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown. With Yorktown out of action for months, the odds had shifted decisively in Japan's favor. The Midway operation would proceed as planned, with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, forming the striking force. The Americans could muster only 2 carriers to oppose them. Victory was assured, but Yamamoto's intelligence was fatally flawed. The Japanese had made a critical miscalculation, underestimating not the damage to the Yorktown, but the sheer determination and industrial capability of their enemy. On May 27, 1942, the Yorktown entered Pearl Harbor. Sailors lined the rails of ships in the harbor, watching in silence as the battered carrier passed. Her flight deck was a patchwork of temporary repairs, her hull streaked with rust and scorched paint. She looked like a ship that should be heading to the scrapyard, not back into combat. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who had commanded Yorktown's air group during Coral Sea, inspected the damage with a team of naval architects and engineers. Their assessment was sobering: 90 days minimum for proper repairs. The structural damage was extensive. Entire sections of the hull needed to be cut away and replaced. The flight deck required resurfacing. Boilers needed to be pulled and rebuilt. Electrical systems had to be rewired. Under normal circumstances, under peacetime conditions, the repair estimate was conservative. But these were not normal circumstances. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood in the operations room at Pearl Harbor headquarters, studying intelligence reports that would change everything. Navy cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code, and the intercepted messages painted a terrifying picture. A massive Japanese fleet was converging on Midway Island, the strategic outpost that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. The attack would come in early June, less than 2 weeks away. Nimitz needed every carrier he could muster. Enterprise and Hornet were already at sea, racing back from the South Pacific. But 2 carriers against 4. The odds were suicidal. He needed the Yorktown, damaged or not. "How long?" Nimitz asked the chief of the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. 90 days, Admiral. Minimum. You have 72 hours. The room fell silent. 72 hours to accomplish 90 days of work. It was impossible. It defied every principle of naval engineering, every regulation in the repair manual, every lesson learned in decades of shipyard operations. "Admiral, with respect, it cannot be done," the shipyard commander protested. "The structural damage alone—" "Then don't fix everything," Nimitz interrupted. "Fix what's necessary to get her back into the fight. I don't need her perfect. I need her operational." And with those words, one of the most extraordinary feats of naval engineering in history began. At 800 hours on May 28th, the USS Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1. Before the water had fully drained, 1,400 civilian workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard swarmed aboard. They came from every department, every specialty, every corner of the facility. Welders, electricians, pipe fitters, machinists, carpenters, painters, an army of skilled craftsmen who understood that the fate of the Pacific War might depend on their work. The shipyard abandoned all other projects. Every available resource was redirected to the Yorktown. Welding equipment, steel plates, electrical cable, replacement boilers, materials were stripped from other ships, pulled from warehouses, requisitioned from civilian contractors. The work proceeded 24 hours a day, with crews rotating in 8-hour shifts that often stretched to 12 or 16 hours, as exhausted workers refused to leave until their tasks were complete. In the bowels of the ship, welders worked in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees, their torches throwing showers of sparks as they cut away damaged steel and welded replacement plates. The structural repairs were brutal and pragmatic. Instead of replacing entire frames, they reinforced damaged sections with heavy steel strapping. Instead of removing and rebuilding the damaged boiler, they patched it with temporary fixes that would hold for a few weeks of operation. Every repair was a calculated compromise between durability and speed. On the flight deck, crews worked to patch the bomb crater. They couldn't properly resurface the deck. That would take weeks. Instead, they welded steel plates over the damaged area and covered them with wooden planking, creating a temporary surface that would support aircraft operations but would never pass a peacetime inspection. The work was dangerous. Welders worked inches from fuel lines. Electricians rewired systems while standing in water. Structural repairs were made without the usual safety margins, without the redundancy that peacetime regulations required. Every shortcut, every compromise, every temporary fix increased the risk that the Yorktown might suffer catastrophic failure in combat, but there was no alternative. The clock was ticking, and Midway was waiting. May 29th, 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, hour 36 of 72. The USS Yorktown had become a floating construction site that defied every principle of orderly naval repair. Welding arcs illuminated the night like lightning storms, casting dancing shadows across the harbor. The cacophony was deafening. Pneumatic hammers, grinding wheels, shouted orders, the hiss of cutting torches, the clang of steel plates being maneuvered into position. Sparks rained down from the flight deck like fireworks, and the acrid smell of hot metal and welding flux hung thick in the humid tropical air. Lieutenant Commander John Greenbacker, the ship's engineering officer, hadn't slept in 40 hours. He moved through the damaged sections with a clipboard, prioritizing repairs with brutal efficiency. Every decision was a calculation. What could be fixed? What could be patched? What could simply be ignored and hoped wouldn't fail at the critical moment? "Sir, the number 3 boiler is worse than we thought," reported Chief Machinist's mate Robert Chen, his face blackened with soot. "The tubes are cracked in 17 places. We need to pull the entire assembly." Greenbacker studied the damage report, his mind racing through the implications. Pulling a boiler meant cutting through bulkheads, rigging heavy lifting equipment, installing a replacement unit, reconnecting steam lines, testing the system. In peacetime, it was a 3-week job minimum. "How many tubes can we plug and still maintain operational pressure?" he asked. Chen blinked. "Sir, that's not... The regulations specify..." "How many?" Maybe 8. 9 at most. But we'd be operating at 70% efficiency, and if any of the remaining tubes fail under combat stress, plug 12 tubes, route auxiliary steam through the backup manifold, reinforce the remaining tubes with external bracing." Greenbacker's voice was flat, emotionless. He was ordering repairs that violated every safety protocol that would make any peacetime inspector blanch with horror. But these weren't peacetime repairs. Throughout the ship, similar decisions were being made 100 times over. In the electrical compartments, technicians bypassed damaged circuits rather than replacing them, creating jury-rigged connections that would work but offered no redundancy if they failed. In the damaged hull sections, welders applied patches that were half the thickness regulations required, knowing they might not withstand sustained combat damage, but gambling they would hold long enough. The civilian workers from the shipyard had been joined by volunteers from across Oahu. Off-duty sailors from other ships arrived to help. Civilian contractors who normally worked on commercial vessels showed up with their own tools. Even office workers and administrators pitched in, hauling materials, running messages, bringing food and water to the exhausted repair crews. Among them was James Watanabe, a second-generation Japanese-American welder whose family had been interned just weeks earlier under Executive Order 9066. He had been exempted due to his critical skills, but the pain of his family's imprisonment burned in his chest as he worked. Every weld he laid down was an act of defiance, a statement of loyalty to a country that had betrayed his family. "Perfect bead, Watanabe," said his supervisor, inspecting a critical structural weld. "You're the best we've got." Watanabe nodded silently, already moving to the next damaged frame. His torch flared to life, and he lost himself in the work, in the precise control required to fuse metal at 3,000 degrees, in the satisfaction of seeing broken things made whole again. On the flight deck, a different kind of miracle was unfolding. The bomb crater that had seemed irreparable was slowly disappearing under layers of steel plate and wooden planking. Aviation machinist's mate Thomas Riley directed a crew of carpenters who were installing the wooden deck surface, measuring and cutting each plank to fit the irregular patches beneath. "It's not pretty," Riley admitted to Captain Buckmaster during an inspection, "but it'll hold. We've tested it with a fully loaded Dauntless, 18,000 pounds. The deck flexes more than it should, but it doesn't fail." Buckmaster knelt and ran his hand over the repair. He could feel the slight unevenness, the way the new planking didn't quite match the original deck. Any pilot landing on this section would feel the difference, would have to compensate for the irregular surface. But it would work. It had to work. Below decks, in the damaged compartments where the bomb had exploded, the scene was apocalyptic. The explosion had created a zone of destruction 3 decks deep and 40 feet in diameter. Bulkheads had been blown outward, decks had collapsed, piping and electrical conduits had been shredded. The compartments looked like they had been attacked by a giant with a sledgehammer. The repair crews couldn't rebuild these spaces. There simply wasn't time. Instead, they sealed them off. Welders cut away the most damaged sections and welded heavy steel plates across the openings, essentially creating a dead zone within the ship. These compartments would remain flooded, unusable, a permanent scar from the Coral Sea battle. But by isolating them, the crews prevented further water intrusion and maintained the ship's overall structural integrity. "We're basically writing off 8% of the ship's internal volume," Greenbacker explained to Buckmaster. "Those compartments will never be usable again without a complete rebuild, but we're maintaining watertight integrity in the surrounding spaces." Buckmaster nodded grimly. The Yorktown would go into battle, carrying her wounds with her, a ship that was part warship and part floating patch job. Hour 52 of 72, May 30th, 0400 hours. Admiral Nimitz made an unannounced inspection, arriving at the dry dock as the night shift reached its peak activity. He climbed aboard the Yorktown, moving through spaces where workers barely glanced up from their tasks, too focused on their work to notice the presence of the Pacific Fleet's commander. In the forward boiler room, Nimitz watched as a crew struggled to align a replacement steam valve. The space was barely large enough for the men to work, and the temperature was suffocating. One worker collapsed from heat exhaustion and was carried out, replaced immediately by another volunteer. "How are we doing?" Nimitz asked the shipyard supervisor quietly. "We'll make it, Admiral. It won't be pretty, and I wouldn't want to take her through a typhoon, but she'll fight." Nimitz placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "The nation is in your debt. Just doing our job, sir, same as the boys who'll sail her." By dawn on May 30th, the impossible was becoming reality. The major structural repairs were complete. Not perfect, not permanent, but functional. The patched boilers were generating steam. The electrical systems were operational, though running through jury-rigged circuits that would make any inspector weep. The flight deck was patched and ready to receive aircraft, but new problems emerged with every passing hour. A critical pump failed during testing and had to be replaced. A welded seam cracked under pressure testing, requiring emergency re-welding. A section of the flight deck patch began to separate, necessitating additional reinforcement. Each problem consumed precious hours from the dwindling deadline. Hour 68 of 72, May 30th, 2000 hours. The Yorktown's crew began returning to the ship, climbing aboard while civilian workers were still completing final tasks. Sailors squeezed past welders, aviators stepped over electrical cables, officers navigated through spaces still cluttered with tools and materials. The ship was simultaneously being repaired and being brought back to life. Commander Oscar Peterson, the air group commander, inspected the flight deck with a critical eye. He walked the length of the deck, feeling for irregularities, checking the arresting cables, examining the catapult systems. When he reached the patched section, he stopped and stamped his foot hard against the wooden planking. "It'll hold," said Riley, who had been watching nervously. "It better," Peterson replied, "because in about 48 hours I'm going to be landing a shot-up Dauntless on this deck at 90 knots with a Japanese Zero on my tail." Riley grinned despite his exhaustion. "Then I guess we better make sure it's ready, sir." Our 72 of 72, May 31st, 0800 hours, the last civilian worker climbed off the Yorktown. The last welding torch was extinguished. The last tool was packed away. The dry dock began to flood, and the massive carrier slowly rose on the incoming water. On the pier, 1,400 exhausted shipyard workers watched their creation come to life. The Yorktown was not the ship she had been before Coral Sea. She carried her scars, her patches, her compromises. Her maximum speed was still reduced. Her internal spaces contained sealed-off dead zones. Her flight deck bore the marks of hasty repair. By every peacetime standard, she was not ready for sea, much less for combat. But she was operational. She could sail, she could launch aircraft, she could fight. Captain Buckmaster stood on the bridge as the Yorktown maneuvered out of the dry dock under her own power. Behind him, Admiral Nimitz watched silently, knowing he was sending a wounded ship and her crew back into battle far sooner than any reasonable commander should. "She'll do, Admiral," Buckmaster said quietly. "She'll have to," Nimitz replied. "Midway is waiting." At 1400 hours on May 31st, 1942, exactly 72 hours after entering dry dock, the USS Yorktown passed through the submarine nets and headed for open ocean. Her crew numbered 2,919 men. Her air group consisted of 75 aircraft. Her repairs were incomplete, her systems were compromised, and her survival in combat was far from certain. But she was sailing toward Midway, toward a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. And somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific, Japanese admirals were planning their attack, confident that the Yorktown lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea, never imagining that the ghost ship was already hunting them. June 2nd, 1942. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Commander Takeshi Naito spread reconnaissance photographs across the polished conference table, each image a testament to Japanese naval dominance. The photographs from Coral Sea showed the USS Yorktown wreathed in smoke, her flight deck ruptured, listing heavily. Subsequent aerial reconnaissance had tracked her limping retreat toward Pearl Harbor, trailing oil and debris. The American carrier Yorktown is confirmed destroyed or permanently disabled, Naito reported to the assembled staff officers. Our intelligence estimates a minimum repair time of 3 months, assuming she even survives the journey to Pearl Harbor. For operational planning purposes, she should be considered eliminated from the American order of battle. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Kido Butai, the 1st Air Fleet, nodded with satisfaction. His 4 fleet carriers would face only 2 American carriers at Midway, Enterprise and Hornet. The mathematics of carrier warfare were brutally simple. More carriers meant more aircraft, more striking power, more ability to absorb damage. 4 against 2 was not merely an advantage, it was overwhelming superiority. "What is the American carrier doctrine?" asked Captain Tomotsu Oishi, Nagumo's chief of staff. "The Americans operate their carriers independently or in pairs," Naito explained. "They lack our experience in coordinated multi-carrier operations. They will likely position Enterprise and Hornet together, making them vulnerable to a concentrated strike. Our 4 carriers can launch 216 aircraft simultaneously, a hammer blow that no 2 American carriers can withstand." The confidence in the room was palpable. The Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades perfecting carrier warfare, developing tactics and training that made them the world's premier naval aviation force. Their pilots were veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the rampage across the South Pacific. The Americans, by contrast, were amateurs, brave perhaps, but lacking the skill and coordination that came from years of intensive training. What the Japanese officers didn't know, couldn't know was that their intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The Yorktown wasn't at the bottom of the ocean or languishing in dry dock. She was at sea, racing toward Midway at 25 knots, her patched hull cutting through Pacific swells, her crew preparing for battle. June 3rd, 1942, 325 miles northeast of Midway Island. The USS Yorktown rendezvoused with Task Force 16, joining the carriers Enterprise and Hornet in a formation that shouldn't have existed. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, assumed tactical command of all three carriers, a concentration of American naval power that Japanese intelligence had deemed impossible. On the Yorktown's bridge, Captain Buckmaster watched his crew conduct flight operations with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The patched flight deck performed adequately, though pilots reported feeling a slight give when landing on the repaired section. The jury-rigged boilers maintained steam pressure, though engineering crews monitored them constantly for signs of failure. The ship was holding together, but every officer knew they were operating on borrowed time. "Sir, message from Admiral Fletcher," reported the communications officer. "Japanese strike force estimated to be 700 miles west-northwest of our position. 4 carriers confirmed, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, expected to launch attack on Midway at dawn tomorrow." Buckmaster studied the tactical plot. The Japanese had no idea the Americans were waiting for them. Thanks to the codebreakers, Fletcher knew the enemy's strength, composition, and intended target. The Japanese, meanwhile, believed they faced only 2 American carriers and had no idea where those carriers were positioned. "Prepare the air group for launch at first light," Buckmaster ordered, "and pray our patches hold." June 4th, 1942. 430 hours. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge as his carriers turned into the wind, preparing to launch the first strike against Midway Island. The pre-dawn darkness was broken by the glow of aircraft engines warming up, the blue flames from exhaust stacks creating an eerie illumination across the flight decks. The strike force was formidable: 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers, 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M-0 fighters. They would pulverize Midway's defenses, destroy its aircraft, and prepare the way for the invasion force following behind. But Nagumo made a fateful decision. He held back half his aircraft, 108 more planes, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship operations. If American carriers appeared, he wanted to be ready to strike them immediately. It was sound tactical thinking, the product of years of training and experience. What Nagumo didn't know was that American carriers were already positioned to strike, already launching aircraft, already hunting him. 600 hours aboard the USS Yorktown. "Launch aircraft!" The Yorktown's flight deck erupted into controlled chaos. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers roared down the deck, their engines straining as they clawed for altitude. Grumman TBD Devastator torpedo bombers followed, slower and more vulnerable, carrying the Mark 13 torpedoes that were supposed to be America's ship-killing weapon, but were plagued with reliability problems. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3 off the Yorktown's deck, his Dauntless climbing into the dawn sky. Behind him, 17 more dive bombers formed up, each carrying a single 1,000-pound bomb, enough to cripple a carrier if it hit in the right place. The Yorktown's air group joined formations from Enterprise and Hornet, creating an aerial armada of 156 aircraft, every operational plane the 3 carriers could launch. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, leaving the carriers vulnerable but concentrating maximum striking power against the Japanese fleet. 700 hours. Japanese reconnaissance seaplane reports. Enemy carriers sighted. The message electrified the Akagi's bridge. American carriers, here, impossible. Intelligence had confirmed only 2 carriers in the entire Pacific, and they shouldn't be anywhere near Midway. "How many carriers?" Nagumo demanded. "Report unclear, Admiral. Possibly 2. No, wait. 3 carriers confirmed. 3 carriers. The number hit Nagumo like a physical blow. 3 carriers meant the Americans had achieved parity with his force. Or worse, if one of those carriers was the supposedly destroyed Yorktown, it meant Japanese intelligence had failed catastrophically. But there was no time for recriminations. Nagumo faced an immediate crisis. His strike aircraft were returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition, needing to land immediately. Meanwhile, his reserve aircraft were armed with bombs for land attack, not torpedoes for ship attack. To strike the American carriers, he needed to rearm his aircraft, a process that would take at least an hour and would require bringing aircraft up from the hangar decks, removing the wrong ordnance, loading the correct ordnance, refueling, and respotting the deck for launch. Recover the Midway strike force, Nagumo ordered, then rearm for anti-ship operations. It was the correct decision by Japanese doctrine. Protect your returning aircraft, maintain your striking power. But it was also a decision that would cost precious time that the Americans were using to close the distance, to position their aircraft for attack. 0920 hours. The first American attack wave arrived. 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Japanese fleet at wave-top height, their slow, obsolete aircraft making them easy targets for the combat air patrol of Zeros. The Japanese fighters fell on them like wolves, their 20mm cannons tearing the Devastators apart. One by one, the American torpedo bombers exploded or crashed into the sea. Of 15 aircraft, 14 were shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water amid the wreckage, watching the battle unfold. The slaughter continued as torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown pressed their attacks. The Zeros and anti-aircraft fire created a killing field. The American torpedoes that did launch mostly malfunctioned, running too deep or failing to explode. It was a massacre, a seemingly futile sacrifice that accomplished nothing. But the sacrifice bought time and drew the Japanese defenses downward toward the sea, away from the sky above. 10:20 hours. The dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, spotted the Japanese fleet through a break in the clouds. 4 carriers steaming in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Ordnance carts stood beside aircraft. The carriers were at their most vulnerable, packed with fuel and explosives. Their defenses focused on the low-altitude torpedo attacks. "Attack!" McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. The dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attacks, plummeting from 14,000 feet at 70-degree angles, their perforated dive brakes screaming. The Japanese carriers, caught in the middle of rearming operations, had no time to react. At 10:22 hours, the first bomb struck the carrier Kaga, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay among armed and fueled aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Bombs cooked off, torpedoes exploded, aviation fuel ignited. Within seconds, Kaga was transformed into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, bombs struck Akagi and Soryu. The results were identical: catastrophic fires, secondary explosions, flight decks erupting in flames. 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded in the span of 5 minutes, victims of perfect timing, desperate courage, and their own vulnerability at the moment of rearming. But 1 Japanese carrier remained untouched. Hiryu. 1100 hours. Aboard the Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched the destruction of his sister carriers with horror and rage. 3 carriers burning, thousands of men dying, Japan's naval supremacy evaporating in flames and smoke. But Hiryu was intact, her aircraft operational, her crew ready. "Launch everything," Yamaguchi ordered. "Find the American carriers and destroy them." Hiryu's strike force, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, launched and headed toward the American fleet. Japanese reconnaissance had spotted the American carriers, had identified their positions. Yamaguchi's pilots were veterans, skilled and determined. They would avenge their comrades, and they knew exactly where to find their target. The carrier that shouldn't exist, the ghost ship that had returned from the dead, the USS Yorktown. June 4th, 1942, 1200 hours, aboard the USS Yorktown. Radar operator Seaman First Class Donald Hicks stared at his scope, watching the green blips materialize 46 miles out, closing fast. His throat went dry. Bogies inbound, bearing 270, range 46 miles, altitude 12,000, count 18 to 20 aircraft. The alarm klaxon shattered the momentary calm aboard the Yorktown. Men who had been resting after the morning strike operation scrambled to battle stations. Damage control parties sealed hatches and prepared firefighting equipment. On the flight deck, crews frantically respotted aircraft, pushing planes toward the bow to clear the landing area for returning fighters. Captain Buckmaster gripped the bridge railing, his knuckles white. The Yorktown had survived Coral Sea, had been resurrected in 72 hours, had launched her aircraft successfully this morning. Now the Japanese were coming for her, and she would have to prove that the hasty repairs could withstand combat. "All ahead flank speed," Buckmaster ordered. "Commence evasive maneuvers. Launch all available fighters." The Yorktown shuddered as her patched boilers strained to deliver maximum power. The jury-rigged steam lines vibrated dangerously, and in the forward boiler room, Chief Machinist's mate Robert Chen watched pressure gauges climb into the red zone. The temporary repairs were being pushed beyond their design limits, but there was no choice. Speed meant survival. 8 Wildcat fighters roared off the deck, clawing for altitude to intercept the incoming Japanese strike. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was all the Yorktown could launch in time. 1205 hours. The Japanese strike force approached. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers from the carrier Hiryu, his eyes scanning the ocean below for the American carriers. Intelligence had reported 3 carriers, but Kobayashi's orders were specific: target the Yorktown, the carrier that Japanese intelligence had declared destroyed at Coral Sea, the carrier that had humiliated the Imperial Navy by refusing to die. Through breaks in the clouds, Kobayashi spotted her, a distinctive American carrier, her flight deck marked with the hasty repairs from Pearl Harbor, her wake white against the blue Pacific as she maneuvered violently. Even from 12,000 feet, Kobayashi could see she was different from her sister ships, could see the scars of previous battle. "All aircraft, attack the damaged carrier," Kobayashi transmitted. "Show them that the Emperor's warriors do not miss twice." The Vals pushed over into their dives, their fixed landing gear creating the distinctive screaming sound that had terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific. 6 Wildcat fighters intercepted them, their 50 caliber machine guns blazing. But the Japanese formation held together. 2 Vals exploded under the Wildcats' fire, then 3 more, but the remaining 13 pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. 1207 hours. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The sky around the carrier erupted in black puffs of exploding shells. 5-inch guns fired proximity-fused shells that detonated near the diving aircraft. 40mm Bofors guns created streams of tracers. 20mm Oerlikon cannons added their lighter but faster fire. The noise was deafening, the sky filled with smoke and shrapnel. Buckmaster conned the ship personally, watching the diving aircraft and timing his rudder orders to throw off their aim. "Hard right rudder, steady, steady. Hard left rudder now." The Yorktown heeled violently, her 20,000-ton mass responding sluggishly but decisively to the helm. The first bomb missed by 50 feet, exploding in the water and sending a geyser of white spray across the flight deck. The second bomb missed by 30 feet, the third by 20, but the fourth bomb didn't miss. 1208 hours. The first hit. The 250-kilogram bomb struck the Yorktown's flight deck just aft of the island's superstructure, penetrating through to the second deck before detonating. The explosion killed 12 men instantly and ignited fires in 3 compartments. Worse, it ruptured the uptakes from boiler room number 3, filling the space with choking smoke and forcing the crew to evacuate. "Boiler room 3 is out of action," reported Commander Greenbacker from Damage Control Central. "We're down to 4 boilers. Maximum speed now 24 knots. 24 knots, the same speed limitation that had plagued her after Coral Sea. The Yorktown was wounded again, bleeding speed, becoming vulnerable. But the attack wasn't over. 1209 hours. The second hit. Another bomb penetrated the flight deck near the forward elevator, its explosion tearing through crew berthing spaces and starting fires that threatened the forward magazines. Damage control parties rushed forward with hoses and firefighting equipment, but the flames spread rapidly through ventilation ducts and cable runs. Seaman James Watanabe, the Japanese-American welder who had worked on the Pearl Harbor repairs, found himself in a smoke-filled passageway, dragging an injured shipmate towards safety. The irony wasn't lost on him, his family imprisoned because of their ancestry, while he risked his life for the country that had betrayed them. But there was no time for such thoughts, only survival mattered. "Flooding forward magazines," ordered Buckmaster. "I want those fires contained in 5 minutes." 1210 hours. The third hit, the final bomb, struck amidships, penetrating 4 decks before exploding deep in the ship's interior. The blast ruptured fuel tanks, fractured steam lines, and most critically, damaged the ship's electrical distribution system. Lights flickered and died throughout the ship. Ventilation fans stopped. Pumps ceased operating. The Yorktown was dying, her hastily repaired systems failing under the stress of combat damage. In the forward boiler room, Chief Chen worked in near-total darkness, illuminated only by emergency lanterns and the glow from boiler fireboxes. The temporary repairs from Pearl Harbor were failing, welded seams were cracking, patched pipes were leaking, jury-rigged systems were coming apart. Water was rising in the compartment, and the temperature was climbing toward lethal levels. "We need to abandon this space," shouted one of his men. "Not yet," Chen replied, his hands working by feel to close valves and reroute steam. "Give me 2 more minutes. 2 minutes and I can keep 3 boilers online." Those 2 minutes felt like hours. Steam hissed from cracked pipes, scalding anyone who came too close. Water sloshed around their ankles, then their knees. The heat was suffocating. But Chen kept working, kept fighting to keep his ship alive. 12-15 hours, the Japanese aircraft departed. Of the 18 Vals that had attacked, only 5 survived to return to Hiryu. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft fire and the defending Wildcats had exacted a terrible price. But the Japanese pilots had accomplished their mission. The ghost ship was burning, listing 7 degrees to port, dead in the water. On the bridge, Buckmaster assessed the damage with grim determination. 3 bomb hits. Fires on 3 decks, boiler rooms evacuated, electrical power failing, speed reduced to 0. By any reasonable standard, the Yorktown was finished, should be abandoned before she capsized or exploded. But Buckmaster had no intention of abandoning his ship. Not after Pearl Harbor had worked miracles to get her back into the fight, not after his crew had sailed her into battle, knowing she was held together with patches and prayers. "Damage control! Report!" he demanded. Commander Greenbacker's voice came through the sound-powered phone circuit, the only communication system still functioning. "Captain, we've got fires on the 2nd, 3rd and 4th decks. Forward magazines are flooded as ordered. We've lost boilers 1, 3 and 6. Boilers 2, 4 and 5 are still operational, but we can't get steam to the turbines. The main steam line is ruptured. Electrical power is out except for emergency batteries. We're taking water through the bomb damage, and the list is increasing." It was a litany of catastrophic damage. Any other ship would be abandoned. But the Yorktown had already died once at Coral Sea and been resurrected. Her crew wasn't ready to give up. "Get me power and get me steam," Buckmaster ordered. "I don't care how you do it. Bypass the damaged systems, reroute everything, tear out bulkheads if you have to. But get this ship moving." Throughout the Yorktown, damage control parties performed miracles. In the boiler rooms, Chen and his team jury-rigged a steam line using spare pipe and emergency fittings, creating a bypass around the ruptured main line. It was a temporary fix that violated every safety regulation, but it worked. Steam began flowing to the turbines again. In the electrical spaces, technicians rewired circuits by flashlight, creating new pathways for power around the damaged distribution panels. They stripped wire from non-essential systems, cannibalized parts from damaged equipment, and created connections that would make any electrical engineer weep. On the hangar deck, firefighting teams battled the blazes with a determination born of desperation. They couldn't save everything. Some compartments were simply too damaged, too engulfed in flames. But they contained the fires, prevented them from spreading to the magazines and fuel tanks, kept the ship from becoming a floating bomb. 20 hours, 1 hour and 10 minutes after the attack. "Captain, we have steam pressure," reported Greenbacker, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and smoke inhalation. "It's not much, but we can make turns for 15 knots. 15 knots. Not the 32 knots the Yorktown had been designed for, not even the 24 knots she had managed after Coral Sea. But it was movement. It was life. "All ahead, 15 knots, Buckmaster ordered. "Commence pumping operations to correct the list. And somebody get me a damage assessment on the flight deck. Can we recover aircraft?" The answer came back quickly. The flight deck was damaged, but operational. The bomb craters could be marked with flags and pilots could land around them. It wouldn't be pretty, but it was possible. At 13:40 hours, the USS Yorktown was making way again, her fires under control, her list reduced to 3 degrees, her crew exhausted but triumphant. They had taken 3 bomb hits and survived. The ghost ship refused to die, but in the Japanese fleet, Admiral Yamaguchi was preparing a second strike. The Hiryu still had aircraft, Kate torpedo bombers armed with the Type 91 aerial torpedo, a weapon far more reliable than the American Mark 13, and torpedo damage was far more lethal than bomb damage, striking below the waterline where a ship was most vulnerable. At 14:30 hours, radar detected the second wave, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters approaching from the west. Captain Buckmaster looked at his exhausted crew, his damaged ship, his depleted fighter cover. The Yorktown had survived one attack through skill, determination, and sheer luck. Now the Japanese were coming again, and this time they were bringing torpedoes. "Sound general quarters," Buckmaster ordered quietly. "All hands to battle stations. Prepare to repel aircraft attack." The klaxon sounded again, and men who had just finished fighting fires and repairing damage stumbled back to their battle stations. They were exhausted, burned, injured, but they were still fighting. The ghost ship would face her second death, and once again she would refuse to surrender. June 4th, 1942, 14:40 hours, aboard the USS Yorktown. The second Japanese strike force approached like a pack of hunting wolves, low over the water, their torpedo-laden Kate bombers skimming the wavetops at 200 feet. Lieutenant Tominaga Joichi led the formation, his aircraft damaged from the morning's Midway strike, but still flyable. He had volunteered for this mission knowing his fuel tanks were holed, knowing he likely wouldn't make it back to Hiryu, but the Yorktown had to die. The ghost carrier had to be sent to the bottom. Aboard the Yorktown, Fighter Direction Officer Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson watched his radar scope with growing dread. Only 6 Wildcats remained airborne. The rest were either shot down, out of fuel, or unable to launch from the damaged flight deck. 6 fighters against 10 torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. The mathematics were brutal. "Vector the cap to intercept bearing 275, Peterson ordered, his voice steady despite the odds. "Tell them to break up the formation, force them to attack individually." The Wildcats dove on the Japanese formation, their 50 caliber guns blazing. They shot down 2 Kates immediately, then a third. The Zeros engaged them, and the sky erupted into a swirling dogfight. But 7 Kates broke through, spreading into a classic anvil attack formation, aircraft approaching from both port and starboard simultaneously, making it impossible for the carrier to evade all torpedoes. Captain Buckmaster stood on the bridge wing, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the Kates deploy. He had fought this battle before at Coral Sea, had maneuvered the Yorktown through torpedo attacks with a combination of seamanship and luck. But the Yorktown was wounded now, capable of only 15 knots, her rudder response sluggish from the list and the damaged steering gear. "All ahead, flank speed," Buckmaster ordered, knowing flank speed now meant a pathetic 15 knots. "Commence evasive maneuvers, all batteries, open fire." The Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns erupted again, filling the sky with tracers and exploding shells. A Kate disintegrated in a ball of fire. Another crashed into the sea, its wing torn off by a 5-inch shell. But the remaining 5 pressed their attacks with mechanical precision, their pilots flying through the wall of fire with the fatalism of men who knew they were already dead. 14:42 hours. The first torpedo. Lieutenant Tominaga released his torpedo at 500 yards, so close that Buckmaster could see the pilot's face through his binoculars. The torpedo entered the water cleanly, its wake a white line racing toward the Yorktown's port side. Buckmaster ordered hard right rudder, but the ship responded too slowly, her damaged systems unable to execute the violent maneuvers that had saved her at Coral Sea. The torpedo struck amidships on the port side, its 450-pound warhead detonating against the hull with a massive underwater explosion. The blast created a hole 15 feet in diameter, and thousands of tons of seawater poured into the engineering spaces. The Yorktown lurched violently, throwing men off their feet. The lights died, the ventilation stopped. Deep in the ship's bowels, men found themselves trapped in darkness as water rose around them. In the forward engine room, machinist's mate second class, William Patterson, felt the deck heave beneath him. The explosion had ruptured the hull just 20 feet from his station. Water was pouring in through fractured seams, and the compartment was flooding fast. "Abandon the engine room," shouted the chief engineer. "Get out now." Patterson grabbed an injured shipmate and dragged him toward the ladder, water already waist-deep and rising. The emergency lighting flickered, casting grotesque shadows. Behind them, machinery that had survived Coral Sea and the morning's bomb attack was being drowned, the Yorktown's mechanical heart dying in the cold Pacific water. 14:43 hours, the second torpedo, another Kate, its pilot already wounded by anti-aircraft fire, released its torpedo at point-blank range before crashing into the sea. The second torpedo struck 20 feet aft of the first, compounding the damage, flooding additional compartments and, most critically, rupturing fuel tanks that spilled thousands of gallons of oil into the sea. The Yorktown's list increased dramatically, reaching 12 degrees, then 15. The ship was dying, her buoyancy failing, her power gone, her ability to fight back evaporating with each passing second. On the bridge, Buckmaster received the damage reports with a sinking heart. Both engine rooms flooded, all boiler rooms evacuated, no power, no propulsion. List increasing, counter-flooding efforts ineffective. The ship was dead in the water and rolling toward capsizing. "Captain, we need to abandon ship," urged Commander Aldrich, the damage control officer. "If she rolls, she'll take the crew with her." Buckmaster stared at his ship, at the men still fighting fires, still trying to save her. The Yorktown had survived so much. Coral Sea, the impossible 72-hour repair, the morning's bomb attack. But 2 torpedoes below the waterline were a mortal wound that no amount of courage could overcome. At 1500 hours, Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order he had prayed he would never have to give: "Abandon ship. All hands, abandon ship." The crew began the orderly evacuation, helping wounded shipmates over the side, launching life rafts, sliding down ropes into the oil-slicked water. There was no panic, no chaos, just the disciplined professionalism of trained sailors, executing an evolution they had practiced but hoped never to perform. Seaman James Watanabe helped lower wounded men into life rafts. His hands burned from firefighting, his lungs seared from smoke inhalation. As he prepared to abandon ship himself, he looked back at the carrier that had been his home, at the welds he had laid during those frantic 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. He had helped resurrect this ship, had poured his skill and sweat into keeping her alive. Now she was dying, and part of him died with her. "Come on, Watanabe!" shouted a shipmate. "She's going down!" Watanabe jumped into the water, the oil coating his skin, the taste of defeat bitter in his mouth. By 1700 hours, the Yorktown floated alone, abandoned, listing 26 degrees to port. Destroyers circled her, picking up survivors from the water. Of the 2,019 men aboard, 141 had been killed in the two attacks. The rest watched from the destroyers as their ship settled lower in the water, waiting for the final plunge, but the Yorktown refused to sink. Hours passed. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The abandoned carrier floated on, her list stabilizing at 26 degrees, her buoyancy somehow maintained despite the massive flooding. She should have capsized, she should have sunk, but she remained afloat. A ghost ship illuminated by the moon, her empty decks silent, except for the creak of stressed metal and the slap of waves against her hull. June 5th, 1942. 0600 hours. At dawn, the Yorktown was still afloat. Admiral Fletcher, observing from the cruiser Astoria, made a decision that shocked his staff. Salvage the Yorktown. If she had survived the night, perhaps she could be saved. Towed back to Pearl Harbor. Repaired again. The ghost ship had refused to die twice. Perhaps she could be resurrected a second time. The destroyer Hammond came alongside the listing carrier, and a salvage party of 170 volunteers, led by Captain Buckmaster, reboarded the abandoned ship. They found her a tomb, dark, flooded, listing at a severe angle that made movement treacherous. But she was still afloat, and where there was buoyancy, there was hope. The salvage party worked through the morning, rigging pumps, shoring up bulkheads, attempting to reduce the list. The minesweeper Vireo took the Yorktown under tow, and the massive carrier began moving through the water at 2 knots, heading slowly toward Pearl Harbor, 1,200 miles away. For a few hours it seemed possible. The Yorktown might survive. The ghost ship might cheat death a third time. But the Pacific War had one more card to play. 1,330 hours, June 6, 1942. Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the American fleet for 2 days. Through his periscope, Tanabe observed the crippled Yorktown under tow, the destroyer Haman alongside providing power and pumping assistance, and the salvage party working on deck. Tanabe maneuvered his submarine into attack position, a delicate dance that required him to penetrate the destroyer screen undetected. He waited for the perfect moment, when the screening destroyers were at the furthest points of their patrol patterns, when the Hammond masked his approach. At 13:31 hours, Tanabe fired 4 Type 95 torpedoes from 200 yards. The torpedoes ran true. One struck the Hammond amidships, breaking the destroyer's back. She sank in 4 minutes, taking 80 men with her. The other 3 torpedoes continued past the sinking destroyer and struck the Yorktown, 1 forward, 1 amidships, 1 aft. The explosions were catastrophic. The salvage party felt the deck heave beneath them, heard the shriek of tearing metal, watched as the list increased dramatically. Water poured into compartments that had remained dry, flooding spaces that had kept the ship afloat. "Abandon ship!" Buckmaster ordered for the second time in 2 days. "Get everyone off now!" The salvage party scrambled over the side as the Yorktown rolled further to port. The destroyers raced in to pick up survivors from both the Hammond and the Yorktown, their crews working frantically to pull men from the oil-slicked water. This time, there would be no reprieve. The Yorktown's list increased to 40 degrees, then 50. Her flight deck, which had launched aircraft just 36 hours earlier, dipped toward the water. The island superstructure, scarred by battle, tilted at an impossible angle. At 0500 hours on June 7, 1942, the USS Yorktown capsized and sank in 3,000 fathoms of water, taking with her the hopes of a third resurrection. The ghost ship had finally died, but she had died fighting, had died after inflicting catastrophic damage on the Japanese fleet, had died knowing that her sacrifice had changed the course of the Pacific War. In Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence received confirmation that the Yorktown had been sunk. Again. This time they were certain. This time there could be no mistake. But the damage was done. The Battle of Midway was over, and Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all sunk by American aircraft, many of them launched from the carrier that wasn't supposed to exist. The Yorktown had fought in a battle she should never have reached, had launched strikes that should never have been possible, had absorbed punishment that should have sunk her twice over. The ghost ship had changed history by refusing to accept her own death, and in doing so had helped deliver Japan's first decisive defeat of the war. June 8, 1942, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. The conference room was silent as a tomb. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat at the head of the table, his face an expressionless mask that concealed the devastation within. Before him lay the casualty reports, each page a litany of catastrophe. 4 fleet carriers sunk, 248 aircraft destroyed, 3,057 men killed. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had rampaged across the Pacific unchallenged for 6 months, had been annihilated in a single day. Commander Takeshi Naito stood to deliver his intelligence assessment, his hands trembling slightly as he held his notes. "Admiral, our analysis confirms that 3 American carriers participated in the Midway operation, Enterprise, Hornet, and—" He paused, the words bitter on his tongue. The Yorktown. The name hung in the air like an accusation. The Yorktown. The carrier that Japanese intelligence had declared destroyed at Coral Sea, the carrier that reconnaissance photographs had shown crippled and burning, the carrier that should have been in dry dock for 3 months minimum. "How?" Admiral Chuichi Nagumo asked, his voice hollow. He had commanded the Kido Butai at Midway, had watched his carriers burn, had survived only because he had transferred his flag to a cruiser before the Akagi sank. How did they repair her so quickly? Naito consulted his reports, piecing together intelligence from multiple sources, interrogations of captured American pilots, analysis of reconnaissance photographs, reports from agents in Hawaii. Our assessment indicates the Americans conducted emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor over a 72-hour period. They did not fully repair the ship. Instead, they patched critical damage, restored minimal operational capability, and sent her back into combat in a condition that violated all peacetime standards. 72 hours, Yamamoto repeated softly. We estimated 90 days. We were wrong by a factor of 30. The implications were staggering. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized thorough, methodical repairs that restored ships to full operational capability. The idea of sending a damaged carrier back into combat with temporary patches and jury-rigged systems was anathema to Japanese thinking. Reckless, unprofessional, desperate, but it had worked. The Americans had gambled everything on speed over perfection, had accepted enormous risks, and had achieved a concentration of force that Japanese intelligence had deemed impossible. 3 carriers instead of 2. That single additional carrier had tipped the balance, had provided the extra aircraft, the extra striking power that had overwhelmed the Japanese fleet. There is another factor, Naito continued reluctantly. The Americans broke our naval code. They knew our plans, our strength, our intended target. They were waiting for us. The silence deepened. Code breaking, intelligence failure, underestimation of enemy capabilities. The Battle of Midway had not been lost through bad luck or tactical errors. It had been lost before the first shot was fired, lost through fundamental failures of intelligence and doctrine. Captain Tomotsu Oishi, who had survived the sinking of the Akagi, spoke bitterly. "We planned for the enemy we expected, not the enemy we faced. We assumed the Americans would follow our doctrine, would repair their ships properly, would operate predictably. We were wrong about everything." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "The Americans have shown us something we did not believe possible, that desperation can be a weapon, that speed can overcome perfection, that a damaged ship crewed by determined men can be more dangerous than an undamaged ship crewed by complacent ones." The admiral stood, looking out the window toward the harbor where Japan's remaining carriers were being prepared for operations. "Gentlemen, we have lost more than 4 carriers at Midway. We have lost our margin of error. We have lost the initiative, and we have learned that our enemy is far more resourceful, far more determined, and far more dangerous than we believed." December 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. 6 months after Midway, the shipyard workers who had resurrected the Yorktown in 72 hours gathered for a memorial service. A plaque was being dedicated to the carrier and her crew, commemorating their sacrifice and the miracle of their resurrection. James Watanabe stood among the crowd, his family still interned, but his own status secure due to his critical skills. He had worked on 3 more emergency carrier repairs since Yorktown, each time pushing the boundaries of what was possible, each time proving that American industrial improvisation could overcome Japanese precision. "We gave her 3 more days of life," Watanabe said quietly to a fellow welder. 72 hours of work bought her 3 more days of combat. "Was it worth it?" The other welder, a grizzled veteran named Murphy, nodded firmly. "Those 3 days changed the war. The Yorktown's air group sank the Soryu. Her presence forced the Japanese to divide their attention. Her survival, even temporary, proved to them that we wouldn't quit, that we'd send damaged ships back into the fight, that we'd take risks they wouldn't dare take." The memorial service began, and a Navy chaplain spoke of sacrifice and courage. But the real legacy of the Yorktown wasn't in the words spoken that day. It was in the fundamental shift in American naval doctrine that her story inspired. January 1943. Bureau of Ships, Washington, D.C. Rear Admiral Edward Cochrane reviewed the new damage control and repair protocols that had been developed based on lessons from the Yorktown. The 72-hour miracle had been studied, analyzed, and systematized. What had been in desperate improvisation was becoming standard doctrine. "We're formalizing the concept of battle-ready versus fully operational," Cochrane explained to his staff. "A ship doesn't need to be perfect to fight. It needs to be good enough. We're training damage control parties to make field repairs that would horrify peacetime inspectors, but will keep ships in the fight." The new protocols emphasized speed, improvisation, and acceptable risk. Damaged ships would be assessed, not by peacetime standards, but by a simple question: can she fight? If the answer was yes, even a qualified yes, the ship would be returned to combat. The Japanese repair their ships to perfection and lose months of operational time, Cochrane continued. We'll repair our ships to adequacy and lose days. Over the course of a long war, that difference will be decisive. The Yorktown's legacy was spreading through the fleet. Damage control parties trained in rapid repair techniques. Shipyards stockpiled materials for emergency repairs. Procedures were streamlined to eliminate unnecessary steps. The entire American naval repair system was being rebuilt around the principle that had saved the Yorktown. Speed over perfection, good enough over ideal, back in the fight over safely in port. June 1943, 1 year after Midway. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, now commanding a new carrier, the USS Cowpens, stood on his bridge and watched flight operations. The Cowpens was part of a massive carrier task force. 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, supporting battleships and cruisers. It was a concentration of power that would have been impossible a year earlier, before Midway, before the Yorktown sacrifice had bought time for American industry to build the ships that were now dominating the Pacific. Buckmaster thought often of his old ship, of the men who had died aboard her, of the 72-hour miracle that had given her a second life. The Yorktown had fought in a battle she should never have reached, had launched strikes that should never have been possible, had absorbed damage that should have sunk her twice over. "Sir, all aircraft recovered," reported the air operations officer. "Ready to launch the next strike." Buckmaster nodded. The Cowpens was everything the Yorktown had been, and more. She was undamaged, fully operational, crewed by veterans who had learned their trade in the desperate days after Pearl Harbor. But she existed because the Yorktown had bought time, had proven that America could take risks, could improvise, could send damaged ships back into combat and make it work. May 1945, the Pacific War's final months. The USS Franklin, a fleet carrier, was struck by 2 bombs off the coast of Japan. The damage was catastrophic. 724 men killed, fires raging through the hangar deck, the ship listing and dead in the water. By any reasonable standard, the Franklin should have been abandoned. But her crew remembered the Yorktown. They remembered that a damaged carrier could be saved, that temporary repairs could work, that determination could overcome impossible odds. They fought the fires, patched the damage, restored power, and incredibly sailed the Franklin 12,000 miles back to New York under her own power. The Franklin's survival was a direct legacy of the Yorktown's 72-hour resurrection. The techniques, the doctrine, the sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up, all of it traced back to that desperate repair job at Pearl Harbor in May 1942. Naval Historical Center, Washington, D.C. Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had discovered the Titanic, led an expedition that located the wreck of the USS Yorktown in 16,650 feet of water. The carrier lay upright on the ocean floor, her flight deck still visible, her island superstructure intact. Deep-sea cameras captured images of the patches from Pearl Harbor, still visible after 56 years underwater, the welded steel plates, the temporary repairs, the hasty fixes that had held together just long enough. "She's remarkably well preserved," Ballard reported. "You can still see the emergency repairs, the jury-rigged systems, the evidence of the 72-hour miracle. This ship should never have made it to Midway, but she did, and in doing so, she changed the course of history." The discovery renewed interest in the Yorktown story. Veterans of the Pearl Harbor repair effort, now in their 70s and 80s, were interviewed. Their stories revealed the full scope of what had been accomplished. 1 to 400 workers, 72 hours, repairs that violated every regulation but worked perfectly when it mattered most. James Watanabe, now 76 years old, visited the Naval Historical Center to see the photographs of his welds, still holding after more than half a century underwater. "We knew the repairs were temporary," he said quietly. "We knew they might fail. But we also knew that every day we could give that ship, every hour she could fight, might make the difference between victory and defeat. We were right." The legacy of the USS Yorktown extended far beyond her 3 days at Midway. She had proven that American industrial improvisation could overcome Japanese precision, that speed could defeat perfection, that a damaged ship crewed by determined men could change the course of history. The 72-hour resurrection became a legend in the U.S. Navy, a story told to every generation of sailors and shipyard workers. It represented the American way of war. Pragmatic, improvisational, willing to take risks that more rigid military systems would never accept. Japan had believed the Yorktown was sunk. They had been wrong, and that single intelligence failure, that underestimation of American determination and industrial capability, had cost them the Battle of Midway, the initiative in the Pacific War, and ultimately the war itself. The ghost ship had returned from the dead in 72 hours, had fought in a battle she should never have reached, and had helped deliver Japan's first decisive defeat. Her legacy lived on in every emergency repair, every damaged ship returned to combat, every sailor who refused to give up when the odds seemed impossible. The USS Yorktown had proven that sometimes the impossible just takes a little longer, or in her case, exactly 72 hours. The story of the USS Yorktown reminds us that determination, innovation, and the refusal to accept defeat can overcome seemingly impossible odds. If you found this story of courage and ingenuity inspiring, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. Share this video with anyone who appreciates tales of human resilience and engineering miracles. And in the comments below, let us know, what other impossible achievements from history would you like us to explore? Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back to life. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept that something cannot be done.